Yeah, so this is an experiment in assessing the use of AI by students. If you can go to the next slide, please, Rachel. The headlines are basically, I tried a new form of assessment. It actually worked even better than I expected, but as always, there are things to improve on and build on. So I'll go into those. First of all, a bit of history. Go on, Rachel, next slide. So this is I've been teaching generative AI for a couple of years now. This is the third year of teaching. Last year, I taught a module called Journalism, Innovation and Enterprise. It's basically a data journalism module for final year undergraduate students on two journalism courses. And I introduced generative AI towards the end of the module, looking at how they could use tools like ChatGPT to reflect on their work, to improve their work, to develop, and basically not to plagiarize. So how do you evidence this? And we looked at prompt design as an employability skill. If we can go to the next slide, please. I showed them things like this. So this was, a very concrete illustration that if you don't declare the use of AI, then you're going to probably get 0%, both in terms of no credit and also potentially plagiarism. But if you're evidencing it, if you're referencing stuff, if you're reflecting and experimenting, you're going to get higher marks. Next slide, please. Now, in the assignment, about half of the students took the opportunity to experiment with generative AI and reflect on that in the evaluation. Not all students had attended the class, like Noha, but we have problems with attendance. And so there was some useful reflection, but if we can go to the next slide. I kind of felt like students were holding something back. I showed them a range of things that they could use generative AI for, and the one thing that none of them talked about was editing or using it to review their work. And I felt that it was unlikely that no single student had done that. So I think there was a cultural barrier here. More broadly, the critical evaluation as a whole, as a format, I just felt wasn't working very effectively. Students weren't reflecting critically. They were kind of just reading bits of books and then quoting them to make it look as if they were engaging with theory, and I didn't feel that they were. So I wanted to tackle that, and I wanted to tackle the lack of transparency. Next slide, please. So what I did this year was I got rid of the evaluation and I asked students to complete what I called an AI diary. And this was basically a documentation of all their interactions with ChatGPT or whatever tools they were using. So total transparency, not just a story about how they used it. This meant that I had to use AI across the whole module because a diary is every week. So I needed to be teaching AI in pretty much every class. I upped the evidence requirement for the journalism that they did. They had to have proof of actually having conducted interviews, not just contact details. This led to a couple of plagiarism cases where people had made up interviews. I gave them an option to opt out of AI. No one took that up. And the good thing about the diary was it meant it was much easier to give feedback in classes and be able to see what students were doing. I also created this CustomGPT, which was a specific AI tool that they could use to get feedback on their work and advice specific to the assignment and to my teaching. But I'm not going to talk too much about that here. If we go to the next slide. So this is what the diary looked like. I gave them a template. It had two columns. On the left-hand column, that was where they put their prompts and responses. On the right-hand column, they put notes. So that's where they would reflect on what they were doing, or they might connect it with wider reading and literature. And so they had a kind of a basis to write in. One student actually chose to use their own kind of format. They discarded this template, which was fine and actually quite good. Next slide, please. Now, a couple of reasons why I did this. This was a piece of research by Kane into AI and pedagogy, and he made a really interesting point that stuck with me about prompts actually embed students' knowledge. So when a student writes a prompt, that prompt reflects what they know. Quite often they're teaching ChatGPT something, or they're using particular techniques. So that was a good way, you know, I can look at their prompts and I can use that to mark their grasp of the subject. Next slide, please. So yeah, this was the other piece of research which was relevant. Critical thinking, it's enhanced if you don't trust AI and you trust yourself. But if you do trust AI, you can have less critical thinking. So that was something that informed the design of this. Next slide. This was the structure of the module. At the beginning, quite a bit of AI, prompt design, things like that, idea generation, less in the middle, and then we bring AI back in towards the end more when we're thinking about interviewees, drafting, reviewing, and so on. Next slide. So the headlines are: this succeeded in the objectives that I was trying to meet. So in terms of transparency, we started to get students talking about using AI in editing, using AI in reviewing their material. So that was definitely, that worked. I think some students still were holding back a little bit, and I can talk more about that later. But in terms of the other objective, there was definitely much more critical evaluation, critical reflection, and it worked in that. As an aside, we also saw students develop this skill set, this prompt design skill set, which is a cross-disciplinary skill set. It's not just limited to journalism. And I think that was quite important because probably more than half of the students in the room don't want to be journalists. They've decided at this point that they want to go into teaching or marketing or something else, but this skill set will still be relevant. Next slide, please. There was a much wider range of use of AI, which is not surprising given it was right across the module and not just one class. And that ranged across all the levels, all the categories of journalism identified in Lee's research, which is linked at the bottom there. I will share my slides actually in the comments for if you want to look in more depth. So the most common uses were sense making, so things like idea development, analysis. There was some research type information gathering activities. There was generation, editing, and so on. And the amount varied. The idea development was all but one student because that was what we did in the workshop in the first session. And likewise, some of these activities took place in workshops. Next slide, please. I surveyed the students at the start of the module to get a feel for what their experiences were with AI and what their attitudes were to AI. And not surprisingly, I found that some students, probably about a quarter of students, were very pro AI. They didn't mention any negatives. And then a smaller proportion of students, but still, you know, probably 1 in 8, were quite anti-AI and didn't want to use it at all. And then everyone else was mixed. So then I surveyed them again towards the end of the module. And what was really useful to see was a change in attitude towards AI. All the ones who were anti or were pro AI had kind of changed their opinion across the module. So this quote illustrates one student's experience. She felt she was closed-minded at the beginning, and now she sees some positives. Next slide, please. Whereas another student started out as a fan, but then became more anti-AI. So you had a much more sophisticated opinion. Next slide, please. All sorts of different ways that people learned about AI. A lot of experimentation, which I was really happy with, because often students can be quite passive in the way that they experience education. So it was good to see trial and error as the second most common way of learning. Next slide. I also asked students about their confidence at the end of the module in different tasks. I'm not going to dwell on that, but it's there in the slides if you want to see it more. Next slide, please. And this is another example of a quote from a student, again, about how her feelings or opinions about AI changed across the course of the module. And this is important because it comes back to that thing about critical thinking and trust. If people are more critical, then less trusting of AI, they're likely to use more critical thinking themselves. Next slide, please. Another nice benefit of this, and this wasn't the objective, but it was an outcome, the performance of students was better. Compared to the last 2 years of the module, more students achieved a first-class grade. If we go to the next slide, the average grade was higher. The proportion of students in the middle two quartiles, that was higher as well. So whatever metric you used, more students were doing better in this form of learning. And on the flip side, more students failed this year than in previous years. And I think that's basically they failed mainly because they didn't refer to any literature in their AI diary. So they didn't engage with literature more generally. Next slide. Why did they do well? Well, one obvious reason is that there wasn't a word limit on this. So the diary was just as long as it was. One diary was 21,000 words. Now, it's worth emphasizing that most of that was responses from ChatGPT or whatever tool they were using. So it might be that 18,000 of those words were not written by the student, that it was only 1,000 words or so of notes and maybe more of prompts. But that still meant you could kind of show your knowledge, show your experimentation much more than when you write a critical evaluation and you tell a story about that. I think probably the main thing to sum up with is that I think what happened here was that using AI forced students to pause and reflect. So regardless of whether they used AI or not, it forced them to think about things like planning, like reviewing, like ideas, just a bit more depth. And that resulted not just in the AI diary being good, but the actual journalism was good as well. And there was probably more motivation for them to do so. So that's kind of my headlines. There are things I can improve, which are in the next slide. But I think that was the key takeaway, was just giving them an opportunity to reflect.